Good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. I am so glad to see some new faces here tonight, including you. If you're new to the library or haven't come here very often, I do encourage you to either come see me and take my business card or fill out one of our cards up there at the front. Because we do this sort of thing 2 or 3 times a week, and we want to see you again. So, tonight's program, the last time that I worked in the food service industry, Richard Nixon was president of the United States. Don't do the math, I'll get there in a minute. It was a barely minimum wage job in a fast food restaurant on Long Island. I was in high school and I only worked a few shifts a week, usually at night. What I remember most about that job is that by the time I got off, I totally reeked of grease. I recall this quite clearly because one night my girlfriend at the time told me the odor was such that she couldn't stand being near me. Indeed, she made it quite clear that if I ever wanted to be physically close to her again, perhaps I should reconsider my employment options. That was 40 years ago. Well, I never contemplated making a career in the restaurant business, and until I read Behind the Kitchen Door, I never really gave, I hate to admit it, but Saru admits it too, I never really gave all that much thought to what it's like for the people who do make a living or try to make a living serving those of us who choose to eat out. But Saru Jayaraman explains it, or rather as she explains it, it seems like we should all be giving some thought to the people whose hands are on our plates when we dine out. Because it's not exactly a pretty picture. In Behind the Kitchen Door, Saru gives endless examples of challenging work conditions, unsanitary and unhealthful practices, racial and sexual discrimination, exploitation, a full menu, if you will, of abuses and practices that, in aggregate, aren't exactly appetizing. Saru is co-founder and co-director of the Restaurant Opportunities Centers United and director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California. Behind the Kitchen Door is, of course, for sale, courtesy of our friends at Reading Reptile, and she'll be signing copies following her presentation. Before her presentation begins, though, she's asked us to show 2 short videos, which will give you an idea of what she's talking about. So why don't we roll the tape? You know what I love about my job? What I love about my job is week after week, I get to bring you the coolest authors in America. Today, we have Saru Jayaraman. Please welcome her.
Thank you so much. I am so impressed with Kansas City. Oh my goodness. I was saying I was in Chicago and there were 80 people in a blizzard. In Philadelphia, there were 80 people. This is extraordinary. You guys read. It's great. It's fabulous. So I always like to start by just asking if you saw anything in the trailers that struck you or surprised you or impacted you in any way. Thank you so much for your questions. I'll take more afterwards. Let me tell you a little bit about the industry. But first, let me tell you a little bit about me, who I am, because you probably don't know my background and how I got into this. I will admit, as was said too, 12 years ago, I knew none of this. I was actually a labor organizer, so I was thinking about workers. I was thinking about working conditions. I had just graduated from law school. I was, definitely thinking about the law and workers. I was organizing factory workers and custodial workers out in Long Island, New York. And every evening, I would come back into New York City and into Brooklyn and enjoy the best restaurants that New York City had to offer. Fusion cuisine, great organic, vegetarian meals, all kinds of great ethnic, all over the world cuisine. And I have to admit, so many meals I ate in restaurants before 12 years ago, and all of those meals, I can only remember one person, their story, their name, who they were, what was going on with them. All those meals I ate out. And I actually argue in the book, statistically, we as Americans, we eat out more than any other people on earth. That's increasingly so. Even during the last couple of years of economic crisis, we have continued to eat out as Americans. And actually, we tend to celebrate our culture in American restaurants more than anywhere else. So birthdays, anniversaries, weddings. I was proposed to in a restaurant. Maybe many of you were. Many of us in America can remember these extraordinary moments in our lives that happen in restaurants. And yet very few of us can remember the people who touched our food in those extraordinary moments. And if you think about the act of cooking and serving at home, if you think about who does that for you in your home, it's typically somebody you love, a parent, a lover, somebody you care about, somebody you know about, right? Those are the people touching your food in your home. In a restaurant, you're having this wonderful, special moment, but the people who are touching your food are completely invisible to you, and almost purposefully so. I argue that most of us interact with these people every day, all day, and yet know so little about what's actually happening behind the kitchen door. So for me, that changed very dramatically on September 11th. A lot of things changed in America on 9/11. A lot of people's lives changed on 9/11. My life changed, and my dining experience changed on September 11th, 2001. Because on 9/11, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1. It was on the 107th floor of Tower 1. It was called Windows on the World. It was way up in the sky above the clouds, and about 250 workers worked in that restaurant. And on that morning, when the plane hit the first tower, 73 workers died. They were mostly immigrants from all over the world. They were preparing that morning's meals. They were preparing actually for a huge banquet that was coming in later that day. And they all died. They all were too high up in the building. People lower in the building ran out or were rescued. These folks actually were above where the plane hit. So they either jumped to their deaths or they were incinerated in the restaurant. 250 workers lost their jobs, and about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks following the tragedy in 9/11. There was a small union inside that restaurant, a very tiny union, because less than 0.001% of all restaurant workers in the United States belong to a union. And so this very tiny union didn't have the capacity to support the workers who had lost their jobs or the families of the victims. And they called me, and they called one of the waiters from Windows on the World, a lead waiter, and they said, "We don't have funds, we don't have money, these workers are not even members of the union anymore, there's no restaurant, there's no contract, we have nothing we can do for them, can you help these workers who had lost their jobs?" And so in the aftermath of the tragedy, just months after 9/11, we set up a little organization called the Restaurant Opportunities Center. And all we were doing was helping restaurant workers get back on their feet. But we were so quickly overwhelmed with cries for help from restaurant workers, first from all over New York City and then from all over the country, that in 12 short years, we've grown into a national restaurant workers organization with now 10,000 members in 26 cities around the country, 100 restaurant employer partners, and several thousand consumer members around the country. We've grown so fast, and we've had to do so much in such little time because the workers have demanded it. So we've won, actually, 13 campaigns against very large, high-profile, actually many celebrity chefs who unfortunately haven't been engaged in wage theft and tip theft, who've discriminated against workers, who've exploited them. So our most recent campaign was against a very famous celebrity chef you may have heard about. His name is Mario Batali. Mario Batali is a big proponent of what's called slow food. He owned a 4-star restaurant in New York City, very famous 4-star restaurant called Del Posto. And workers approached us from the restaurant saying not only were their tips being stolen, but that there was a very abusive, racist chef who would hurl racial epithets at them. These workers were from Latin America and from Bangladesh. And they were not able to advance to waitstaff positions. Now, if you know anything about fine dining, the difference between a busser and a waiter can be a 5 times difference in salary. You could go from earning $30,000 or $20,000 in a city like New York to earning $150,000 as a waiter in New York. Now, these folks were saying less experienced white students, actors were being brought in, trained by them, and then promoted immediately above them to waitstaff positions. So we organized the workers. We actually joined forces with Slow Food USA. We said, what is slow food? You know, is it just sustainably, locally sourced, organic food, free-range chicken, local produce? Is that what sustainable food is? Or does sustainable food have to include the people who actually touch your food? Because if you care about sustainability, if you care about your health, you actually can't just think about the cows and the pigs. You have to think about the people, right? So we worked for a year with Slow Food USA, and after a year and a half, we not only won over $1 million in stolen tips and wages for the workers, we actually won paid sick days for all of the workers in the company. We got the company to get rid of that racist, abusive chef and to give promotions to the workers of color, to create a new promotions policy. And in fact, Mario Batali, to his credit, has joined us as a partner in doing a different way of in promoting a different way of doing business, which we call the high road to profitability. So we've actually organized about 100 employers around the country. They range from celebrity chefs like Mario Batali, and actually Tom Colicchio, star of Top Chef, is an excellent employer and a really good partner of ours. I was actually just on Up with Chris Hayes on MSNBC with Tom. He's a really good guy, and he really believes that promoting from within and treating your workers well actually helps your business. All the way down to small mom and pop restaurants all around the country that are trying to do the right thing, you know, provide good wages and good working conditions, and still they manage to make a profit. So we've got these 100 employer partners around the country. We've opened our own worker-owned cooperative restaurants called Colors, one in New York. Actually, that first trailer was filmed in Colors, New York. That's our restaurant. We don't treat our workers that way. That was staged. We have opened a second restaurant in Detroit. And in these restaurants, we have created a pretty sophisticated training program that we've now replicated in other cities around the country, where we train thousands of workers each year to move up the ladder to livable wage jobs in the industry, those fine dining waitstaff and bartending positions. We've trained now over 5,000 workers around the country. And then we've done a ton of research, you know, thousands and thousands of surveys of restaurant workers. That's the basis for the book. We've won some local, state, and federal policy campaigns. At the local level, we raised the minimum wage in New York State for tipped workers from $3 to $5. We won a bill in Philadelphia that makes it illegal to deduct credit card processing fees from workers' tips, which, by the way, is legal everywhere else, which is why I encourage you to leave your tips in cash rather than on credit cards. So we've won some things, but for me, the most extraordinary thing about the last 12 years since 9/11 has been getting to know the stories of thousands and thousands of workers around the country, and those are the stories that are in this book. 12 years ago, as a New Yorker, I knew I should probably tip well, right? I was told I should tip around 20%, so that's what I did. I had no idea that for most workers in the United States, for most workers in the US, the tip is not actually on top of a wage. It is the wage, right? And that doesn't come from God, or it doesn't fall from the sky. It is because of a man named Herman Cain. Do you remember Herman Cain? Herman Cain was a nominee, right? Or he wanted to be a nominee in the Republican Party for president, right? Formerly head of Godfather Pizza. And in 1996, he was the head of the National Restaurant Association, a very powerful trade lobbying group that we call the Other NRA. The Other NRA back in 1996, under Herman Cain's leadership, struck a deal with Congress, saying that we, the NRA, will not oppose the overall minimum wage continuing to rise in Congress as long as the minimum wage for tipped workers stays frozen forever. And so it has. It's been stuck at $2.13 for the last 22 years. Not because these restaurants can't afford to raise it, but because of a behind closed doors political deal that they struck back in 1996. And so it's been stuck. And so people like Victoria struggle to pay the rent, right? To not be homeless, to put food on their families' tables. So this was something I didn't know. 12 years ago, I knew something about health and safety in restaurants. I think most of us have an idea about sanitation. I grew up in LA where they actually put letter grades in windows of the restaurants to tell you how healthy or how sanitary is the restaurant. I had no idea that 90% of restaurant workers in America do not have paid sick days, which means that 2/3 report cooking, preparing, and serving our food when they're sick. With true story from my book, H1N1, or I just met a worker who worked with typhoid fever, or the common flu. These are things that people are working with when they're sick, not because they want to be sick on your food, but because they don't have a choice, right? When you live on tips, you have to go to work. When you're told you'll be fired if you call out sick, you have to go to work. So I didn't know that. 12 years ago, I knew something about competition in the restaurant industry. We've seen the shows Top Chef, Iron Chef, chefs trying to vie to make it to the top. I had no idea that for the vast majority of workers in this industry, getting to even a livable wage job is often a matter of your skin color or your gender. There are over 10 million restaurant workers in America. It is, in fact, neck and neck with retail as the largest and fastest growing sector of the U.S. economy. It is one of the only sectors of the U.S. economy that has grown over the last couple of years of economic crisis rather than declined. As every other sector of the economy went into the pits during the last couple of years, the restaurant industry continued to grow because we continued to eat out. The industry is doing great, and yet it also happens to be the employer of 7 of the 11 lowest paying jobs in America. And the 2 absolute lowest paying jobs in America, lower than farm workers, lower than every other job you think of as a low paying job, guess what? Are restaurant jobs. That means that the largest and fastest growing sector of the US economy is proliferating the lowest paying jobs in America. And that also means that these are the jobs that are now available in our economy because this is the growing industry. The growing industry is growing poverty. Do you know that right now, 1 in 4 American workers works in a poverty wage job? A poverty wage job means they're eligible for public assistance. 1 in 4 Americans. By 2020, that's 7 years from now, 1 in 2 Americans will work in a poverty wage job. That means half of us will be working in poverty. I'm not saying living in poverty. I'm saying working full time and living in poverty. What does that mean for our economy and our ability to spend and our ability to grow as an economy? And where is that growth coming from? That growth entirely from 1 in 4 to 1 in 2 is coming entirely from the restaurant industry. And it is not because this industry is suffering from miserably low profit margins. Guess what? The data shows that this industry across the board has 4 to 5 times the profit margin of Walmart. Walmart, which is considered to be a very profitable company, the restaurant industry has 4 to 5 times the profit margin of Walmart. This is a highly profitable industry that has struck a deal and proclaims proudly that they have won $1 billion in exemptions for themselves from the minimum wage. The National Restaurant Association proclaims as a benefit to their members, what have we won for you? We've won $1 billion in exemptions. They've won $1 billion in exemptions by not having to pay their own workers' wages and expecting you, the people who eat out, to pay their workers' wages for them. So I ask you, what is it called in any other context when an employer hires somebody and doesn't feel like they have to pay them? That's called slavery. Because when you get a paycheck of $2.13 an hour, you get nothing. Let me tell you one of the stories in my book. A young woman named Claudia Munoz, a leader in our organization, an immigrant from Mexico who worked at an IHOP in Houston, Texas, earning $2.13 an hour. Now, when you earn $2.13 an hour, federal law says that the restaurant is mandated to pay the difference between the minimum wage for tipped workers of $2.13 and the federal minimum wage of $7.25. Here in Kansas, I believe it's $3.63 and $7.50. Is that right? Something like that? Not much better, right? I'm sorry to say, not much better here. So the restaurant is supposed to make up the difference between the tip minimum wage and the regular minimum wage. But the IHOP, mega corporation that it is, and even though it's illegal, told Claudia, we don't want to have to be held liable for the nights that you don't make up the difference in tips. We're going to report that you're earning $7.25 regardless of what you earn. So Claudia would go many days earning 2, 3, 4, many graveyard shifts when nobody would walk into the IHOP where she earned no tips at all. And she was being taxed at $7.25 even when she was earning $2, $3, and $4 an hour. And Claudia says, I was hungry. Guess what? Servers in America have 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce and use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce, which means the people who bring and put food on our tables cannot afford to put food on their own families' tables. And they're not rich steakhouse servers that you might see in a New York City. The vast majority of servers in America are Victoria or Claudia. They're women. 70% of servers in America are women. They have children. They use these jobs to put food on their table, and they take great pride in hospitality. If you talk to Victoria, she won't tell you, oh, I stayed in the industry for 22 years because I couldn't find something better. She loves hospitality. She lives it. She breathes it. She takes great pride in serving others. So did Claudia. But Claudia was so hungry, living on $2, $3, and $4 an hour, she would wait to get to the restaurant to eat pancakes. That was the only meal she could have. And she told me, I'm ashamed to admit it, Saru, I'm ashamed to say it, but I would flirt with the cooks so that I could get extra food because I was so hungry. One night, Claudia worked a whole graveyard shift at the IHOP, and at the end of the night, a couple walked out without paying the bill. And the IHOP, mega corporation that it is, and even though it's illegal, required Claudia to pay for that bill, which was $20 more than all of the tips she had earned that whole night. And so Claudia ended up paying $20 for the luxury of having worked at the IHOP 8 hours overnight. And she left that evening crying, and she said to me, it's one thing for me. I'm younger. I'm trying to go to graduate school. I'm trying to, better myself. Maybe I'll eventually go to law school. But for the other women who worked alongside me, this was their career. They were mostly older. They had children. This was their livelihood. And this is how it was night after night. Some days you got tips. Some days you didn't. Some years you could pay for Christmas. Some years you couldn't. If any of you have read Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed, you may remember a section of that book where she was a waitress in a diner. And it was that section where she actually lived in her car because she couldn't afford to pay the rent. And I guarantee you, in almost every restaurant in America, there's at least one person who is either homeless or what we call home insecure. They are struggling to pay the rent, living on somebody's couch, living in a car, living with a friend, crashing on a boyfriend's couch because they cannot continually pay the rent. And these are not, people who are not working. These are people who are working more than full time, sometimes putting several part-time jobs together to make ends meet. These are people who are working. And as President Obama said in the State of the Union, in the United States of America, we should not be working full-time or more than full-time and living in poverty and relying on food stamps? What happened to the idea of you get a job and you can survive? Not in the restaurant industry, and that's the industry that's growing. Another story in my book. A Korean immigrant, a young man named Eun Chang, was living in California, where California is actually the largest and fastest growing restaurant industry in the country. And guess what? In California, there is no difference between the minimum wage for tipped workers and the minimum wage for everybody else. It's $8 across the board for everybody. And in San Francisco, it's $10.50 for everybody. And those are the fastest growing restaurant industries in the country. So when we hear the National Restaurant Association saying, we can't raise wages, it will kill the industry, the sky will fall, we say there are 7 states in the country, including the largest and fastest growing restaurant industry in the country, that manage to pay their workers good wages, right? So Eun was living in California, he was a bartender, he had just graduated from UC Berkeley, he was doing really well. He decided, I want to go be a part of, politics. He would say, I'm gonna move to our nation's capital and try bartending in Washington, D.C. Do you know what the tip minimum wage is in our nation's capital? $2.77. $2.77. Eun was serving senators and congressmen, and he was serving people from the White House and earning $2.70 an hour and living on his tips. And when you live on your tips, as I said before, you cannot afford to take a day off, even when you're feeling really sick. So that happened to Eun. One day he felt a tickle in his throat. The next day he was a little wobbly on his feet. By the 3rd day, he could barely stand up and serve the guests. It went on for a couple of days until one day he couldn't get out of bed. And he called the restaurant and said, I can't come in. No response, no offer of paid sick days, nothing. He couldn't get out of bed. And it went on for about 2 months. He couldn't get out of bed, didn't have health care, had no idea what had hit him, until finally he thought, I think I'm gonna die. I better go see a doctor. And he thought, maybe there's somebody in the Korean immigrant community who would take pity on me and tell me what's wrong with me. So he found a doctor in Koreatown in Washington, D.C., who gave him some free service and told him, you have H1N1. Eun was out for 2 months, racked up about $10,000 in credit card debt, barely made it out alive, and went back to the restaurant, and of course they had replaced him. And Eun says, I never knew how many people I infected. My coworkers, the customers at the restaurant. Who knows? Who knows? I never got my job back. I ended up in all this debt. And Eun says, but imagine that was me. I'm a single guy coming from California. I think about all of the people in the back of the house or in the rest of the restaurant who have families. What would have happened to them if I had infected them and they were out for a couple of months? What would have happened to their kids? When we don't give the people who touch our food very basic decency and rights, like a livable wage or paid sick days or the opportunity to advance to a livable wage job, we hurt ourselves, we hurt our health, and we hurt our economy. Fortunately, I don't want to be all depression because actually we are in the most exciting, thrilling moment our organization has ever encountered. We are about to win. So a couple of years ago, we started to go to the Hill in Congress, in Washington, D.C., and take restaurant workers from all over the country and start to demand enough is enough. 213, enough is enough. Nobody can live on this slave wage. And about 3 or 4 years ago, Congresswoman Donna Edwards from Maryland introduced the first bill in U.S. history to specifically address the needs of restaurant workers. It was called the Wages Act. It was a big victory for us because it proposed raising the tip minimum wage to 70% of the regular, meaning repegging it to the regular minimum wage, allowing it to continue to rise, and finally overcoming the legacy of Herman Cain. So that was a big victory for us when she introduced that bill, but we knew she was a junior congressperson. And so it was a bigger victory for us when we got Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate to introduce the Comprehensive Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2012, last June, which finally proposed raising the minimum wage and raising the tip minimum wage. They took our proposal and Donna Edwards' proposal to raise the tip minimum wage to to 70% of the regular. And you may have heard, we were all there on Capitol Hill on 2/13. We always do this annual day of action on 2/13 to highlight the tip minimum wage being 2/13. We were all there this year when President Obama mentioned in the State of the Union that we need to raise the minimum wage. And in the policy brief that he put out that day from the White House, he said we have to raise the tip minimum wage as well. It was the first time a president in 22 years had mentioned that we need to raise the tip minimum wage. And just a few weeks later, the Fair Minimum Wage Act was reintroduced into this Congress, the Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2013, and it's been gaining momentum on the Hill, so much momentum that we think we can move it, but only through a movement, through a groundswell. In fact, the congressperson who introduced it was George Miller from California, and he said to us, to overcome the power and voice of the NRA, the other NRA, we are going to need to see a groundswell of public support, which is ludicrous, right? By the way, this is an issue, according to Gallup poll, that polls at 71% popularity, Republican and Democrat alike. The masses of Americans are in favor of raising the minimum wage and the tip minimum wage. But Congress doesn't actually listen to the masses of Americans. They listen to lobbyists like the NRA. So we need to build a groundswell to tell them, stop listening to the NRA, right? So we thought about it. Where had we seen a groundswell in our industry over the last 12 years? And there had been one. A guy named Eric Schlosser wrote a book called Fast Food Nation. And another guy named Michael Pollan wrote a book called Omnivore's Dilemma. And a movie came out you might have seen called Food, Inc. And suddenly, there was this groundswell of popular demand for locally sourced, organic cuisine. Free-range chicken, right? Organic strawberries, local produce. There was this increased demand for good quality food. And it resulted in the restaurant industry actually doing something about it. We saw restaurants across America change their menus, declare we provide locally sourced, we provide organic menu items, we provide free-range chicken. Whether or not they did, they said they did, right? And it was a trend. And so we knew that if consumers speak up, ask for something, demand something, it happens. The industry responded. So we realized we need our Michael Pollan moment. That's what I like to call it. Michael Pollan wrote Omnivore's Dilemma. We need our Michael Pollan moment. We need to build our consumer engagement campaign. So the first thing that we did is we actually created a consumer guide. You can download it for free on your phone, on your smartphone. It's called the ROC National Diners Guide, and it tells you how the restaurants around you are faring on issues of minimum wage, paid sick days, promotions practices. It's free. And when you eat out, you can see how is the restaurant you're eating at doing, and you can actually send them a message, a little tweet that says, you know what, I love the food, I love the service, but I actually would like to see you provide paid sick days. That's important to me as a customer. That was the first thing we did. The second thing that we did is we wrote the book. The book is our call to action. It's not just a book. The book is our way of saying to America, please, if you care about your health, if you care about the economy, if you care about good food, you have to think about the people who are touching it. Eric Schlosser wrote the foreword to the book, and Danny Glover has created a series of short film portraits based on the workers and employers profiled in the book. Danny Glover's also making a full-length fiction feature film about the story of ROC, my organization, and the restaurant industry, which is really exciting. And through all of this, we're building a groundswell of public support to tell Congress, look, you've got to listen. People care about these issues, right? So there are three things we'd like to ask of everybody who's here tonight, of everybody, if you eat out, please help us by doing these three things. The first is to buy the book and to let other people you know buy the book. We don't need you to buy the book for the money. You know, the money goes to the organization, not to me. That's a good reason to buy the book. We don't need you to buy the book because I need to be a best-selling author. I would love to be home with my 8-month-old and my 3-year-old. I don't need to be on a 30-city book tour. We need you to buy the book because we need that Michael Pollan moment. That moment, if we can hit the New York Times bestseller list, that moment when it becomes common parlance in America, just like it became common knowledge that there's locally sourced cuisine, that free-range chicken is much better than factory poultry, right? Just like it became common knowledge about that, we need 213 and paid sick days to be common knowledge among people who eat out, right? So we need your help. The book is getting a lot of attention. We're now what's called a national bestseller. We've beat out all the chef books on Amazon. We were the #1 book on the bestseller list at Powell's, which is the largest independent bookstore in the country. We've done pretty well. I've been on a bunch of shows. I was on CNN with Soledad O'Brien. I was on Up with Chris Hayes and Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC. I was on Bill Moyer's Journal. And tomorrow night, I'm going to be on Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. So we're doing pretty well, but we need your help. We've sold several thousand copies of the book. We just need to get up a little bit higher to get on the New York Times bestseller list and have that Michael Pollan moment where people in America know not just about good food, but that good food means good conditions for the people who are touching that food. So that's number one. Number two, the second thing we'd like to ask of you is that we realized that we were building this groundswell of public support, but we didn't have the evidence to show Congress that we had actually built that groundswell. So we actually created a new organization called The Welcome Table. It's thewelcometable.net. It's an online to offline space where you can actually go, sign up, sign a petition. We've already collected more than 100,000 signatures on a petition to Congress asking them to raise the minimum wage, raise the tip minimum wage. We need you to join. We're actually doing also offline activities we're calling eat-ups, where people can gather, even here in Kansas City, at a restaurant, learn something about the restaurant industry, eat together, have good food, and take an action together, like tweeting the restaurant or tweeting your congressperson. You can do all of those things when you join the Welcome Table at thewelcometable.net. And do we have signature pages? Yes, so we're going to be passing around sign-in sheets for you to sign the Welcome Table and give us your email or an email that we can use to build this organization into an online organization with hundreds of thousands of signatures. We don't have, but you can go on thewelcometable.net and sign up there. So the third thing I'd like to ask of you is to please not leave tonight. Maybe this is not your thing, maybe you're not interested, that's okay. But the one thing I ask of you is to please not leave tonight thinking that the best thing you can do is tip better when you eat out. Or to think that you should just stop eating out because it's too gross. Neither of those things is the best thing you can do. Because if we just continue to tip better and do nothing else, we continue to subsidize an industry that refuses to pay its own workers' wages, right? So we need you instead to join your voice along with many people around the country who are already speaking up every time they eat out. So don't tip better, tip well, please. But don't just tip better or don't just stop eating out. Eat out. Eat out wherever you want, whenever you want. At the worst offenders, eat out. Eat out. But at the end of your meal, please speak up. We're asking you at the end of your meal to go up to the manager and say, love the food, love the service, but I would love to see you provide paid sick days, or I would love, love, love to see you provide a livable wage to your workers, because guess what? As a customer, that's important to me. So I'm just going to tell you one quick story of how I did it to make it a little bit easier. So when my first daughter was born, she was just literally a few weeks old, or maybe a few months, I don't remember. We took her to her first restaurant outing because, as I said, we as Americans celebrate these beautiful special moments in restaurants. So we celebrated her first restaurant outing. We were on vacation, we were in Santa Cruz, California. It was a beautiful day, beautiful, organic, locally sourcing restaurant, brunch spot. We went there, we ate out, we were having a good time, taking pictures of her, the baby. But I happened to notice that all of the servers were white and all of the bussers were Latina. And if you took a peek in the back of the house, literally, and this is true in so many restaurants, the further back you went, the darker the skin color got, right? So I noticed this, and I noticed that the Latina bussers were working their tails off. And so at the end of the meal, my husband took the baby out, and I went up to the manager. I said, I love the food. I love the service. I so want to keep coming here. I want to keep coming here as a paying customer. But I got to tell you, your bussers are amazing. They're amazing. What opportunities have they had to advance? Because I noticed none of them are servers. And he said, oh, I don't know. I've never thought about it. I don't think they want to be servers. None of them have ever asked me to be a server. And we hear this a lot from employers. It just doesn't cross their mind for whatever reason. And so I said, I appreciate that. I just want you to know as a paying customer, it's really important to me to see diversity in the workplace. I like to see people who work hard move up in the ladder. And I think they'd be great servers. They work really hard. And the other thing is, I'm a new mom. It's really important to me that my new daughter can see people of her skin color in every position in the restaurant so that she thinks as she grows up, she could be anything. She could do anything. That's really important to me. And he said, well, thank you very much. What was he going to do? He wasn't going to spit at me or slap my face. You know, when I go around the country asking people to do this, people are so scared. But it's amazing how much we're willing to ask, what's in this food? Is it vegetarian? I'm not going to eat it. Take it back. Is this locally sourced? Take it back. But we're not willing to say at the end of our meal, I really would appreciate it if you would pay a living wage. And it's not that I imagine just from that one conversation, that manager just changed his practices overnight. But I do think that if 24 people said that same thing over a 6-month period at that restaurant, you better believe that restaurant would do something about it. They've done something about it in so many other instances, with locally sourced, with organic, with so many other things, right? So we have power. We have a lot of power to speak up every time we eat. We have power with our forks. We have power with Congress. We have power. We're not using it. But we need to, because we do eat out more than anybody else on earth. And as long as we're eating out, we need to make sure that we are healthy, the people who take care of us are healthy, and believe it or not, the employers will do better as well. All of us will benefit when these workers are treated and paid better. In fact, it will be a better dining experience for all of us. So thank you so much. I think we're going to have questions and answers, right?
Well, that was absolutely fantastic, Saru. I love your passion, and I love your message tonight. And so we have time for about 10 questions, and then behind the kitchen door will be available for sale, and Saru will be signing copies. But I do want to say, I do as moderator's choice, I do want to ask the first question. You said it wasn't just about tipping alone, but it seems to me that generous tipping is part of the process, and maybe tipping in cash is really something that everybody should think about doing. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, as I said, it's not that we don't want you to tip well. We want you to tip well. You know, these workers rely, as you now know, maybe you already knew, these workers rely on your tips as their wage. You know, I just was interviewed for a big German press, I think it was a radio show. And the guy from Germany said to me, I have to ask you a question. And, you know, it was a different question than most reporters asked me. He said, why is it that Americans put up with such low-wage jobs? You know, why is it that America puts up with this, right? And so I went into this long history. Actually, there's been this communications campaign by the right to say, we need to have low wages for businesses to thrive, which is not true, right? And we've proven it not to be true over and over and over again by employers who pay better, by states that pay better, and do well anyway. So anyway, you know, on the tipping point, Europeans always see tips on top of a wage because workers are paid well, a minimum wage, and the tips are on top of a wage. So that when they come to this country as tourists, they don't expect to tip that much, right? We, on the other hand, know that people in this industry rely on our tips to live, to survive, as Victoria did, right? They rely on our tips to pay the rent. So as long as that's the case, we need to tip well. But my point was that can't be the only thing that we do. Because if all we do is tip better, you know, Barbara Ehrenreich, I talked to her while I was writing the book, and she said, yeah, you know, people told me after I wrote the book that, gosh, I read your book, and now I always tip better. And I said to her, I really hope that's not what people leave my book thinking. I don't want them to think I just tip better and I can erase that memory of that talk from the library from my mind. I just feel better about myself because I tip better. Because by doing that, we continue to allow this industry to get subsidized by us, right? And that's what they want. When you ask the industry, why is it like this? Why is it 213? Why is the tip minimum wage lower, right? There's several arguments. One of the most appalling that I've seen them say is that, well, paying people 213 allows the customers to express their pleasure or displeasure when they eat out in paying workers, right? It allows the customers freedom to do that. So yes, we can express our pleasure or displeasure, but hopefully on top of a secure and stable wage that ensures that the person isn't homeless or hungry or too sick to take care of you, right? Here.
So I'm a member of the service industry, and I just want to talk about the importance of like the rippling effect too. I work for a bakery, and this year my bakery, not my company, the bakery I work for, changed their mission statement to having employees first and then product second. And we have 3 weeks paid vacation. I have
That's great.
Insurance, male, female maternity leave.
That's great.
And that's been that way since '93, but it's not really a talking point that we have. We have to say that we're local and we use local ingredients, and that kind of steals our thunder. And I think for a lot of us, we need to ask those questions and expose that, because I think the fact that there's 48 employees at Farm to Market Bread Company with health insurance
Proves that it can be done, right? Proves that it can be done. And this is what I like to say. Companies like that do well, not in spite of paying their workers well, but because they pay their workers well. We've seen time and time again, and we've documented it through research. These folks have less turnover. I bet you not many people have left since they've had health insurance. Less turnover, far less turnover, higher productivity, higher profitability, because workers feel invested in the success of the business. Imagine how much happier your server is going to be serving you, right? Selling you things, selling you wine, selling you food, if they actually are not sick, if they can pay the rent, if they're not worried about their child back at home. You know, I heard an incredibly sad story from a member. This was a member in Chicago. She worked at a McDonald's, and she worked there for 20 years, and her 12-year-old daughter had a heart attack. And because they didn't have paid sick days, she couldn't take a day off to go and see what had happened to her daughter in the hospital. And after a while, you know, she tried to stay, and then after a while, she left her job, which was essentially quitting, because if you take a day off when you're sick, you know, that's pretty much it, right? She lost her job. So I hear these stories constantly, and that is why the industry experiences 300% turnover, so much more turnover than other industries. It's because they don't treat their own people like professionals. In fact, this is another argument the industry makes about why they pay people low. Oh, these are just actors and students. They're moving on to something better, which I find extraordinary. This industry is saying that there's something much better than themselves, right? Why would you say that about your own people and your own jobs? Because you don't consider them to be the professionals that they are, right? So these are not people moving on to something better. For the most part, they are women, they are moms, they are people who rely on these careers, and they take great pride in their jobs. And the turnover doesn't come from people moving from restaurants to something better. It comes from people moving from restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, looking for a better livable wage, a way to support their family in a job that they actually take pride in.